It is now my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Bernstein. But Jonathan, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and I'm going to give you the Zoom.
Oh, thank you very much, Suzanne. I appreciate it, and really glad to be with everyone here today. This is an exciting conference. There's a lot to dig into, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and try to center, the important ideas that we'll be talking about today. So just bear with me for a moment while I get my screen sharing up. Okay, sorry, thanks. Well, we are very excited to talk to everyone today about the topic of climate investments and the Torah and how those all intersect. Um, I guess I can give you a little bit about my background, like Suzanne, and then I'll jump back to what we really want to talk about today. So, educated at Yale, also at the Yeshivat HaMiv Torah in Israel. I was a Wexner Heritage Fellow, and now I'm a co-member of the Wexner Climate Summit. Also, Sonia Cummings, who I'm very honored to have on the call today, and who's also talking on Tuesday. A great group of people who have been thinking very deeply about how the Jewish world can address climate change. On the financial side, which is what I do for a career here in Philadelphia, I'm a certified financial planner, a CFA charter holder. I used to be the director of research at a large investment management firm where I created the firm's sustainable impact portfolios. And that's really in 2017, I really got my started in the sustainable investment field. Um, and then I'm now a financial advisor. I run my own firm, Bernstein Planning Investment Management, where I help people with their financial plans. And I also manage sustainable investment strategies for individuals and institutions. In terms of what are we going to talk about today, and how can we get some direction and insight from the Torah into the climate issues of today? So these are the questions I really want to try to address. One is, what obligations do we have regarding our possessions in general? Secondly, why should we invest at all? Are we obligated actually to invest any of these possessions? Then we can link it to climate. So why or why not hold fossil fuel investments? Are we morally obligated to sell fossil fuel investments? Then are there Torah examples of taking action on climate change? And if so, is there a connection to how to take action on fossil fuel investments specifically? And lastly, if one does decide to sell fossil fuel investments, what are different approaches to doing so? So we'll try to go from a very conceptual Torah point of view to a very practical investment point of view at the end. Okay. And hopefully we can make this interactive. I'll pause to get your insights. So, but first, I think when we want to think about what does the Torah Jewish ideas have to say about investments, we really have to start with this idea of possessions in general. And really, what is our responsibility for our possessions? And I think a very good place to start with that is this Mishnah on the section of the Talmud Arichin that really deals with what you're allowed to donate to the temple. And we can see that in this Mishnah, it's going to go from the ideas of what one can donate to the temple to much more general idea of what one can do with one's property, and begin to give us a framework for what are the limits and what is the need to preserve some of our property. So the Mishnah says a person may dedicate for sacred or priestly use some of his flock and some of his cattle and some of his Canaanite slaves and maidservants and some of his ancestral field. But if he dedicated all that he has of any type of property, they are not dedicated, i.e. the dedication does not take effect. This is a statement of Rabbi Eliezer. And we can already begin to see some of the limits that one is allowed, right, to dedicate things to the temple. But there's actually, right, if one goes to the extent of dedicating all of that one has of a type of property, it's not just that you shouldn't do this. It actually is saying it doesn't even take effect. You can't, from a Jewish point of view, get rid of everything that you have. And the first part of this mission, right? This is just referring to when it comes to the temple, but we have the next statement, which really extends this, much greater. And I'd be curious to see, what people have to think about this. But Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, if for the Most High a person may not dedicate all his property, it is all the more so the case that a person should spare his property and not give all of it to others. So the Mishnah here is really extending, going from what one can do to the temple and to God, to actually say, no, this really applies to everybody for everything in terms of their giving away their possessions. And I'm curious to see if people have any responses or insights from just this text about what this would imply about what we are allowed to do and what we are not allowed to do with the things that we own. And if anyone wants to raise their hand and jump in, please go ahead. Yeah, Scott, do you want to?
Yeah, yes, thank you. No, it's an very interesting passage. I'm reading a book which I want to kind of bring in to this because maybe Rabbi Jacob Siegel, if you know his work at all.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just reading this book. He put a book out last fall, Put Your Money Where Your Soul Is, kind of exploring the Jewish text background for the issues that you're talking about, investment or divestment in fossil fuels. And I mean, I'm one of the interests I have is sort of looking at the Jewish connection for this. And I think what you're doing is really kind of amazing, is sort of the depth of the Jewish thinking about this, which I didn't realize, which is one of the reasons I wanted to get the book and look at this, is sort of what is that Jewish connection? I mean, the wisdom of the Mishnah and the text and how they thought about these kinds of things is pretty amazing. So, I mean, clearly this particular portion you're talking about, people thought, well, we don't want people to give all their money because then they're going to be broke, and then maybe they'll be on welfare or something, and then we have to support them. So there's got to be some moderation of that kind of giving going on. So that's sort of my look at that is sort of thinking, wow, these guys really thought about this kind of issue. We don't want people to go poor, getting rid of everything they own just to take care of a particular problem, because then it's like a burden on the community in some ways. Or it's not, it's not consistent with some of the other aspects of Torah that are important.
Yeah, no, Scott, I think you said it, very eloquently. Sorry, hold on one second. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my screen sharing. Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, I think you said great, great book that you did mention, which really gets into that. We can put the details of that book in the chat, Scott. But yeah, no, definitely. I think the thread that we see developed in later sources, right, is taking these sort of seemingly more esoteric ideas about dedication to the temple, and actually turning into more of I'll go on to posit surely almost an investment philosophy, but certainly a philosophy of what one should do or not do with one's possessions, because we see in the Talmud on this section, which I won't go into, but it gives a source in the Torah for this rule of not giving away everything that one owns, and then the Rambam then connects it to, he actually establishes, based on someone else in the Talmud, essentially a limit of giving away 20% of one's possessions for charity or for mitzvot, or for for other purposes. And he, the Rambam, funny, I mean, he goes as far as to say that people who essentially give away all their possessions are essentially just being stupid. But I was really interested in this next source of the Rambam, where he takes the idea of the Mishnah and like Scott was saying, he begins to give it a reason, why, in fact, the Torah might say, what, you really shouldn't give away all your possessions, and more than that, if you should not just give away possessions, what you should do with whatever you're not, essentially not, you're not giving away to the temple, or in our day to donate in general to causes, what should you do with it. And so in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam's, the Maimonides, greatest, work, where he, brings together so much of Jewish thought, and essentially was, creating a document that could guide Jewish people and essentially their entire lives. He really builds on this idea in the Mishnah, and he says one is forbidden to renounce ownership of or consecrate all of its possessions and thereby become a burden to society. And I think, right, I think Scott, you mentioned this idea really, right? Like essentially that if one gave away all that one owns, one, would essentially, instead of helping society, really the thought is actually, this would not be a good precedent. And it's interesting from a financial planner's point of view that essentially the focus of a lot of financial planning is on establishing that someone will not run out of money. That's sort of, the purpose of a lot of, the work that financial planners do, is to say, okay, if you take a certain path, you will not become a burden to society, you will not run out of money. And then I think from, again, someone who's involved in investments, like this is really a fascinating set of ideas that Maimonides talks about next. He says he should not sell a field and buy a house, sell a house and buy chattels. And chattels really just means movable property. So, or use money acquired by selling his house for trade. Conversely, he should sell chattels to buy a field. The rule is that he should aim to improve his financial position and to exchange the impermanent for the permanent. And for me, that really seems like that could be an investment philosophy all unto itself. That, essentially, what one should be doing with one's possessions is to grow them, to improve your position. And the best way to do that is to find some way to establish a permanent set of possessions. My mind is just really viewing that a field, so to speak, was kind of the idea of something permanent. Today, I think it's reasonable to say, and this is again my personal opinion, right, that that stocks and bonds would essentially have that feeling of permanence as well. And then Maimonides, he also adds at the end, was interesting, his intention should not be to enjoy slight momentary pleasure or to enjoy some slight pleasure for which he incurs a great loss. Which again, to me, and then I want to open up to see if other people have ideas, this sort of implies, right, you shouldn't gamble or be very speculative in the way you approach trying to improve your financial position, but to take a more of a measured approach. So I'm curious, to see, how do people see the connection between the Mishnah that we saw before about, this idea of the temple and not giving away all possessions, and then how the Rambam kind of expands it, and then seems to be pointing us in a certain direction in terms of what we should be doing with our possessions. If anyone wants to jump in, please.
David, Jonathan, I think Myron wants to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to be rude, so that's why. Thank you for inviting me. I became an environmentalist at least 40 years ago, and within a decade decided to become a deep environmentalist. And the difference between the two is about the word natural resources. So in the Torah, it says you should be a steward of the planet. It gives the impression that means that we own it and we have to make sure it doesn't get damaged. On the other hand, like we talked about in the very previous session, people are deforesting our land. And we didn't just start deforesting now, then the North America, or what's now United States, was a vast wilderness. And as we deforested, we created a tremendous amount of environmental problems. We didn't even realize how much the buffaloes were sequestering carbon for us until after we almost completely destroyed them. We can't treat the buffaloes or the trees or anything else as resources that we own, we can just dispose of and move them around. We have to treat all wilderness as sacred. That doesn't mean we can't eke out a living in the spaces in between. In fact, we now know that we can grow cattle on land that can stay in a natural state and doesn't cause problems, and we have clean, better food and make more money by the farmers. These either or choices are completely specious. We don't have to do these things. And the idea of ownership is kind of, in my opinion, anti-Jewish. And the reason why I think that is because I was in the midst of writing a, what would you call it, Haggadah, so to speak, for an event many people don't care about in Judaism, but I care a lot about, is the holiday with the trees. I forgot the name of it.
Yes, Tu B'Shvat.
Tu B'Shvat, right. And we were looking for stories in there, and we found a story where a rabbi was approached by two gentlemen who asked them, who said, I own this land, and the other man said he owned the land, and the rabbi looked at all of the evidence, and he decided to put his ear to the ground to see who owned the land, and the land said, neither of them own me, I own them. The land, we are owned by the earth. We are part of the earth. We can't own the land. And this notion is antithetical to what's good for the environment. I'm not saying I'm against economics, completely to the contrary. But when we start thinking that everything is a disposable resource, we are in deep doo-doo. And I think that's a problem that isn't, I don't see you talking about it, Jonathan. And I don't think you're talking against me. I just like to see a conversation go in that direction.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I think a lot of the things you say apply to some of the things we'll be talking about shortly. Specifically, though, what you're saying in terms of using the land, exploiting the land, I think is very much connected to this idea in Maimonides here that we see that essentially the emphasis should be on the permanent rather than the impermanent, and that taking an approach to our assets with an emphasis on the short term for momentary pleasure, for anything that would undermine the permanence of our possessions, seems to be, from the Rambam's point of view, is actually, the opposite of what we should be doing. So I think that very much does, connect to, again, reading into certainly, the Rambam's ideas, but certainly I think it does connect to say, right, that we should take a more of a permanent point of view with our possessions. And I think we can make that jump to our investment, so that we should be taking an approach that where we are not buying investments that might work for the short term, might make some money while we use up resources, but in fact we should be thinking about from a more of a permanent point of view. So I definitely think that is a really good intro to essentially to the next part, where I really want to turn to fossil fuels, and to get a little bit more focused on how we can connect the climate itself to the Torah, and why I think this applies to essentially all of us. And this is, probably, those of you who have thought about this before, know a lot about this, but maybe, some of you have not thought about it in such a directed way that, if you do own stocks, right, unless you have decided otherwise to take out fossil fuel investments from your holdings, you definitely own fossil fuel investments. And this, essentially what I'm showing here, looks at just the S&P 500 stock index, and essentially that's the largest, best known stock index of the 500 largest stocks in the United States. And essentially about 9% are invested in fossil fuel related investments, and that could be coal miners, companies producing oil and gas. It could be utility companies that are using coal or other fossil fuels to create electricity. And so this is something that's relevant to all of us. So I think, kind of once we kind of, realize, and I'm, probably most of us do that, this is relevant to all of us. We can begin to think about, okay, so then what are some of the reasons to hold and not hold fossil fuel investments? Because I think it requires some thought and conversation to really, understand if selling fossil fuels investments is the appropriate response to climate change, or if perhaps there are other ways that one might want to address the climate change. So of course, there are many, many reasons to not hold fossil fuels. I'm just going to talk about two of them today, and only the first one will I really dive into from a Torah perspective. But first is I think the one most of the time people talk about, which is the moral imperative. So if fossil fuels are disrupting the climate, right, imperiling humanity, then supporting the sale of fossil fuels by owning shares of fossil fuels company, that's not appropriate. It's something that shouldn't be done. And we'll dive into that, in a moment. But I think it's important also, in the investment community, I think we also think about not owning fossil fuels as an investment decision. Essentially, if you believe that fossil fuel companies are not going to do well versus other types of investments over the long term, then actually to sell their fossil fuels investments, they might be just a good, prudent long-term decision. And one reason might be if if you believe society is going to phase out fossil fuel use, then fossil fuel companies, they may be owners of assets that are going to lose all or most of their value over time, and thereby those would not be good investments. So, but yeah, there are many, many possible, points to discuss in these, but I want to focus in on the moral imperative side and see if there are some Torah sources that can help to, guide us in whether actually selling fossil fuels is something that really we should be doing from a Torah as well as moral perspective. So I think, a really great source for this moral side of selling fossil fuels comes from the 19th century Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Writing in Germany, he wrote really a wonderful text in 1837 called Horev. And what he really tries to do is to explain from his point of view, the reasons for the commandments, and really to inspire people to connect the commandments with their own sense of meaning of the world, and to unite the two, such that essentially, so that the Torah really speaks to us as people. And he is a very traditional rabbi, but I think taking a very modern perspective in trying to make sense of the Torah. And so he goes through many, again, sort of more seeming today esoteric parts of the Torah, but he really shows how they have a very meaningful, currently impactful ideas in them. And so in his explanation of Nezikin, which is essentially all the Torah laws about who has responsibility for damages, this is how he opens, which I think, I'd be curious to hear, what people think. But he opens with a very powerful explanation of property and possessions. So he says, man, in taking possession of the unreasoning world, becomes guardian of unreasoning property, and is responsible for the forces inherent in it, just as he's responsible for the forces of his own body. For property is nothing but the artificially extended body. Thus is the person responsible for all the material things under his dominion and in his use. So when I read this, this is something that I hadn't personally really thought about before. That essentially that property, we should really think of it as really parts of extensions of our own bodies, and I think that then also extends this idea that there's a certain holiness, there's a certain sacred responsibility to the things that we own, if they're really extensions of our own body. And so I think this is really that brings the issue to climate change, and what we are personally doing, that essentially Rabbi Hirsch is saying, that we are responsible for all the things under our dominion, and essentially we have to think very carefully about the impact of that. And he's learning that from the Torah laws about who is responsible for damages. And he goes on to say, which is making a very interesting distinction, which I think is the one that's relevant for investments. He says, you have all the more extensive responsibility for your property that is inanimate and devoid of any instinct, and is thus completely subject to your will. So, some of you may be familiar that in the Torah that there's a fair amount of discussion of what happens if your ox goes and causes damage, and whose responsibility is it, and what the consequences. And he's really saying that actually, right, your responsibility for your inanimate property is actually greater than what you have for things that actually have some will of their own. So animals clearly have minds of their own, intentions, but your property, including, in my opinion, your stocks and your investments, you have actually much more responsibility, because those are completely within your domain to decide what to do with them. And then finally, he says this, which to me seems to apply the most to the climate. He says, as a special commandment, the Torah imposes the duty: remove from your property all that is dangerous to life, or by means of adequate protection, render it harmless. And there certainly are Torah sources that he's directly talking to of why he says this. But to me, that really says, remove from your property all that is dangerous to life, seems to me, again, to be a way for one feels that essentially fossil fuels are endangering the environment. It's definitely a way to read into this that, yeah, that actually you should not own these types of investments. I don't think that's the only reading that one can take, but I do think this is one way to find a source in kind of all of our literature of Torah ideas for why it would make sense to not own fossil fuel investments. But I, curious if I found this a particularly interesting source and seemingly very relevant today. Curious if any comments or reflections on it from anyone in the audience.
Jonathan?
Yeah. Hi, Sonia.
I'm sorry, my video doesn't work, but
That's fine. Yeah.
I found this very powerful. I had never heard of this text, and it can apply to anything. I mean, obviously investments, but you think of plastic, the whole campaign on plastic, and what we do in our daily habits, and what we accumulate, and the legacy we leave to our children or grandchildren. It's really, thank you for sharing this. I find this really powerful.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah, I thought it was really, I think the way that he is creating sort of a hierarchy of responsibility for our things seems to me to be very important because, one of the things that I think sometimes gets overlooked in discussions about the climate and what we should do about it is that people just have limits to what they individually can do, and maybe that connects to this idea that we kind of started with, that there are limits to what one can donate. But for me, this is helping to focus to say, okay, right, there are things that you're going to have more responsibility for in terms of your possessions. And one of those things should be the things that really don't have minds of their own, things that are inanimate. And then even more so, right, if something is dangerous, you have all the more responsibility to deal with it, to make it no longer dangerous to life. It seems to me to be potentially a way that people could use the text to try to order their actions. And I'm really curious to then look at the next source because I was really looking trying to find a example in the corpus of Torah text for when a community or individuals were actually dealing with the climate and a climate crisis specifically, and what their order of actions were, what they actually did in terms of the steps that they took, and can we take the example and use that perhaps to imply something about what we should be doing with our own lives and specifically with our investments. So it's pretty interesting, and maybe some of you have seen this example before, but in the Mishnah, in the part of the Talmud that deals with fasts in Ta'anit, it talks about, first of all, it just talks about the whole process of asking God for rain, right? Specifically, there seems to be in the Mishnah's point of view that there's some essentially human component to getting rain to come at the right time, and so in the Mishnah there's a whole bunch of Mishnahs about this. This is not certainly not the entire text from all the Mishnahs, but I think really gives the crux of what we want to talk about. is and it starts with Rabban Gamliel says one starts to request rain on the 7th of Mar Heshvan. So in the month of Mar Heshvan, the Jewish calendar, on the 7th, that's when we start to actually, ask for rain, and that's, essentially the custom that many people continue to this day. But then things sort of get interesting in the next Mishnah, in the middle of the screen. If the 17th of Mar Heshvan arrives and rain has not fallen, then individuals, but not the entire community, begins to fast, 3 fasts for rain. And then at the bottom, if the new moon of Kislev arrived and the rain has still not fallen, the court decrees 3 fasts in the entire community. So that's about 13 days later. So, so there's a period of time when we're not doing anything. Then individuals start to take action. And then there's, next is, okay, there's a sense, right, the entire community. Okay, so then what happens if, still, now 23 days have gone by since when rain should be coming. It's in my view, that's a climate crisis, because it's really putting all the crops at risk. And then actually, so there's more missions in between, and actually there's even more fasts basically that occur. But if all the fasts that get decreed have passed and they've not been answered, the court does not decree additional fasts, but the entire community observes the custom of mourning. They decrease their engagement in business transactions, in building and planting, in betrothals and marriages, and in greetings between each person and his fellow, like people who have been rebuked by God. So to me, this is kind of amazing, specifically in light of thinking about there is some kind of financial connection between, if the climate is not going right, then we should take a different perspective on building and planting, and specifically in our business transactions. I thought this was, we're starting to run out of time, and so I'm going to go forward a little bit faster now. But essentially, there seems to be an ordering of actually maybe individuals are taking responsibility first, and then the community, and then beyond just the community doing things on a very general level like fasting, they should be changing their behavior even when it comes to business. And I don't think this is prescriptive in any way to what to do about the climate crisis today, but I thought it was an interesting example of how Jews in the past thought about dealing with the climate and when something is going wrong. So I do want to make sure we get time to talk about specifically some related to how to go about not holding fossil fuel investments. I do think it's also very important, though. There are reasons to continue to hold fossil fuel investments. I'm not saying necessarily that I would say what is right and wrong, but just want to point out that engagement by shareholders of fossil fuel companies that has been successful, right? So, for instance, people that own Exxon were able to campaign to get represented to Exxon's board who had more knowledge about renewable energy. And then the second point is that most of the fossil fuel reserves are actually not owned by these fossil fuel companies like Exxon, but actually more by government or state energy firms. So there is some thought to think more about how do we pressure governments to divest fossil fuels rather than in the investment markets. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about, for those convinced that they should sell their fossil fuel investments. So for those who do want to go ahead, and then after I go through this, I do want to give a little time for questions. There's 2 main ways to do it. One is just to commit you're not going to add any future holding in fossil fuel companies. So you sort of say, okay, what I have already in my investments, that's going to be harder to change, but I feel like I can make the commitment. I'm not going to add anything further in fossil fuel companies. And then there might be a reason like a tax consequence, which typically that's not an issue for nonprofits, but for an individual there might be some tax consequences. They sold their investments, or maybe just the investment strategy you want is not available without fossil fuel investments. So there might be reasons that you feel like you can't do it with your existing holdings, and that sort of ends up. I think if we can kind of run through all these ideas that we've talked about, from the Mishnah saying there's limits on what we're allowed to give away, to the Rambam saying that we should essentially make our portfolio permanent, to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who's really saying actually we have a commitment to not just make our possessions permanent, but actually to make them non-harmful. We can come up with different types of essentially ways you can structure your portfolio. And ultimately, the way I would classify those are, you can make your portfolio fossil fuel free. So essentially, right, to eliminate all current investments in fossil fuels, and also to commit to not adding anything in the future. For some people or some institutions, they can do this. Others, aren't quite in the position to do that. So they make a commitment to be a full commitment. It's called, so they're going to become fossil fuel free over a set period of time, but continue to hold some fossil fuel investments for the time being. Then there's essentially investors who make a partial commitment. They just say, okay, we can eliminate some, but not all types of fossil fuel companies. So maybe definitely can sell all the coal investments, or I'm not going to own any stocks that hold fossil fuels, but my bond portfolio is harder to manage without fossil fuels. And lastly, I would say all investors can also consider the flip side of not owning fossil fuels, which is investing in renewable energy. So it's not just about eliminating the harm, but also to think about what the solutions can be and how one can support that. Okay. I've run through a lot. I'm curious, any questions, comments that people want to make? Yeah, I see Scott with your hand.
Sure. No, thank you for this presentation. I'm curious about how widespread is this conversation in the Orthodox community to sort of look at the texts in the context of this climate change issue, and sort of a corollary is that how did you come to this sort of study?
Thank you. I think the Orthodox community, not particularly widespread, unfortunately. I think me personally, I came to it really first through the investment, through my professional side. I really, had not been a lifelong climate activist, and honestly, I saw, there was some interest in my former firm in this type of investing, and I didn't really know if there were kind of good ways to implement it. And once I actually discovered, it's a very thoughtful way to invest, and there's actually very some excellent ways to do it. I actually became quite enthusiastic about it. And then that's, I'd say, in the last few years, my involvement with the Wexner Foundation, and this group of people, including Sonia, who's on this call, and Fred, who's talking later today, kind of galvanized my own interest to kind of bring together my interest in investing, my interest in the climate, and my longstanding interest in Judaism, which I credit to my mother, who's on the call as well.
Good. Yeah, as I mentioned, I read this book by Jacob Siegel, and just based on your comments today and what it made me curious about how widespread this conversation is right now in the Orthodox community, even whether it's going on in any conversations in yeshivas, I mean, certainly the issue is kind of relatively new as far as, discussion in the general population. So I don't know if it's crept into yeshivas or, some of the, Orthodox students are concerned about the climate and they would bring it up in their classes.
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely something that should be happening. Myron, what would you like to say?
Well, I want to make two comments, one about what Scott said and one about what I
Yeah.
just put in the chat session. First of all, I asked my rabbi to make a comment about the last two sentences of Bereshit, or Genesis, for those who don't know the Hebrew name, which talks about Joseph's actions to disenfranchise all the Egyptians so that no one owned the trees or could take care of the trees of their grandparents. And therefore, in my opinion, there was a good chance the trees would die, and not surprisingly, 400 years, there'd be many environmental plagues, just like what happened to the Anasazi Indians 400 years ago. And he refused to comment on it, even though he told everyone he was about to give a drash on it, but he couldn't find a text in anything he could find, so he ignored the subject altogether. And it aggravated me to no end. And so that's a Chabad community. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that I have three inventions, one of which I didn't invent. It's called ice making air conditioners that went out of business because it wasn't supported by adequate investment or a rate design. And it's incredibly powerful to lower the greatest load and to shift the demand when the price of energy is cheaper, which is not unusually when the carbon footprint of electricity is smaller. Similarly, for energy efficient leasing and for electric vehicle parking lots, these are economic niches I'm creating so that one could create a business that could be on the stock market and you can invest in it. Instead of having money in the dirty technologies, you could have them in the clean ones. And my nonprofit is building these niches.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important point, Myron, that you bring up, that essentially, and I'll just end with this, that recent performance of investments without fossil fuels have been very, very similar to investments, with fossil fuels. And so essentially, I think more and more investors are being given the opportunity to be able to invest in a way that is essentially more supportive of the environment, in a way that doesn't compromise their investment returns. And I think I would say that, in my opinion, is consistent with the Torah sources. And hopefully, as Scott has mentioned, we will be able to, bring that message to a wider group of Jews, in the future. But thank you very much, everyone.
And I want to thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I know we're going to use the Zoom room for the next one. There are some great sessions left the rest of today and Monday and Tuesday, and we hope you will join us on some of those sessions. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Jonathan, thank you for your presentation. It certainly gave us a lot to think about. Everybody take care. Happy Passover, and we'll see you at other sessions. Thank you very much.